Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I'd like to talk today about the phrase to err is human. Now, there are two senses in which this can be meant, the first one being fairly anodyne, and the second one is the one I'm interested in because it touches rather directly on my video that talked about the asymmetry between good and evil. So the first one, just to get it out of the way, is the observation that you pretty much can't find people who don't make mistakes. And a general corollary of this is that you should typically have tolerance within reason for your fellow creatures, who, when they make mistakes, because you yourself do too, and to some degree you just have to expect that people will. There are a few other side things, and if you expect, if you've got any plan that relies on everyone doing what they're supposed to, on everything going right, your plan will almost certainly fail. Okay, so there are various things like that. Reasonable observation, lots of good corollaries, something worth learning. There's another sense in which people take this, however, and this is the sense in which it touches on my video, and that is that people take it to mean there is something about being human which necessitates erring, where in fact that if a person were not to make mistakes, they would not in fact be fully human, or not human at all. It varies a little bit. And this is where the distinction between good and evil, where good is a positive existence and evil a negative existence, becomes so important. Just to give a super brief recap, because I know not everyone has watched my previous videos, the distinction between good and evil being that good has a positive existence and evil is the absence of good. It looks like something positive and has a shape in the same way that if you hold your hand up and use a flashlight, that the shadow on the wall looks like it has a shape, but in fact it doesn't. What has a shape is the light. The light actually exists. The light has a shape. It's just because of how we're used to seeing things, how our brains work to a great degree, we're used to looking at that shadow and saying that it has a shape. Well, this actually shows what the problem is with saying that to err is human, in the sense of to make mistakes is part of being human, and that if you didn't make mistakes, you wouldn't be human. Because the human part of you is the part of you that's actually capable of doing things. The mistakes are mistakes are failing to live up to being human. Now, it is incredibly common to fail in this manner, but it is not, properly speaking, a part of it. And you can see this in an analogy, like, for example, if you were missing a leg, you would stumble. I'm assuming, no prosthetics and so on. That, you could not walk in a normal bipedal manner if you had only one leg. But to be missing one's leg, because, say an alligator bit it off, or you lost in a hunting accident, whatever, the thing is, you would not, the fact that you can't walk bipedally is not, properly speaking, a part of you. It is an accident in the sort of Aristotelian sense. It's not something that is natural to you that you can't walk. It's simply your current condition, because you do not, in fact, have all of you that there is supposed to be there. So in that same way, the fact that we make mistakes fairly frequently is not a part of us, but rather simply part of our current condition. And it's somewhat understandable that one could think that this is part of the human condition, because when one looks out, it is a common human condition. But it is. But the very fact that we all make different sorts of mistakes really points to the distinction, really. And you can take this in an analogy that nobody, we don't talk about the inability to hear ultrasonics. Like what a bat does for echolocation. Actually, not a great example, because some people may be able to do some echolocation. But, nobody can see into the ultraviolet spectrum. No one can hear the really high ultrasonics, stuff above 100,000 hertz, for example. And so we don't take the fact that we can't hear above 100,000 hertz. We don't take the fact that we can't see in the ultraviolet spectrum, or that we can't see X-rays, or we can't see gamma rays, to be a mistake on anybody's part. It is normal that we don't have that ability, in the sense of it is proper to a human being not to have that ability. On the other hand, missing a leg or missing an arm, or your ears not working, things like this is something that you can tell is unnatural, because many people do in fact have these things, whereas nobody can see into the into the ultraviolet spectrum. No one can hear above 100,000 hertz. And moreover, there is nothing about us which seems to depend upon these abilities, in the same way that we are clearly built for walking on legs because none of the rest of us is all that good at getting us around. Hence why you can see where people who have this sort of disability will use machines to get around. They don't just normally get around using their other appendages for getting around. In contrast to a bird, you can sometimes see, I've seen, if you've ever been to New York City, there are an amazing number of pigeons. And, pigeons with various physical injuries they've sustained. And if you look, a pigeon that is missing a leg has trouble hopping around, but then they don't hop most of the time. They will tend to use their wings and fly, because in fact flying is natural to them, as is walking, and so they can compensate with one for the other. We don't have anything like that. We don't have alternatives. I mean, there are people who, in certain circumstances, can sort of get around walking on their hands, which is very impressive, incidentally. Anybody who manages to overcome a disability, I think, is owed a tremendous amount of respect because they're doing something hard, and many of them succeed at it, and I think they're all owed a great deal of respect for that. But it is nonetheless unnatural to have to put that work in, which is not the same thing as that you can't choose to, of course. But so getting to it in that, using that, using a physical impairment as a metaphor for spiritual ones, because the physical stuff is easy to see in a literal sense. If you have a hard time telling the truth, because whether very often it's because your courage is underdeveloped, but not telling the truth comes from a number of other things too. Having an underappreciation for the truth, having I think most of the rest, frankly, does come more or less to courage. You don't have the courage to really face up to what might happen if you tell the truth, in one form or another. A lot of times it's sort of intermediate though, because you don't have the courage to think through, is anything bad really going to happen? Be that as it may. This comes from having, either underdeveloped courage or an underdeveloped appreciation for the value of the truth. And so people will therefore lie, but that doesn't mean that lying is natural to them. That means that lying is the result of some faculty of theirs being underdeveloped. Or again, when you have people who, say for example, cheat on a romantic partner. Again, there are underdeveloped virtues which are essentially responsible for this. Be that a lack of trust, be that an underdeveloped ability to appreciate something that's already been appreciated. That's the getting bored sort of thing. Whatever the particular causes may be, and there are lots of them. If you look, each one is going to have that there's some faculty that is underdeveloped. But again, you can tell that this is a human faculty which is underdeveloped because you can look at all the people who don't make this mistake and look at what it is that enables them to not make this mistake, and you will see that it is some virtue that is actually fairly common. And moreover, and it's something, and when we're talking in the moral realm, something that you blame a person for not having. There's an asterisk again on that, and this is a particularly Christian thing, because it's always hard to tell when somebody is lacking some particular virtue why. It might be because they were raised particularly badly. It might be because they have, just some impairment you don't know about. I mean, a lot of them come from raising, but, there are other things. There are physical deformities of the brain, where parts of the brain weren't developed right, or, there are things like, benign tumors pressing on the wrong part can have strange effects. There are all sorts of things within this world that we can't know about being outside of a person, being outside of another person, and especially, their mind. And so this is where the Christian idea of not judging comes from, and is important, I think, always bears reiterating in any sort of context like this when we talk about blame, that a person may be blameworthy, but that doesn't mean that for any given individual we know whether they are blameworthy. There may be things we don't know about them, and hence why judging is such a terrible idea, because we don't know the context, we don't know what they are dealing with or what they're not dealing with, or what went into this. So they might be very blameworthy, they might not, any given person, but the act itself is a blameworthy act. It just may be that the fault is actually rather removed to the person who abused a child, or who neglected them, or who failed to teach them, or what have you. This comes under the heading of we don't know what we're doing, because everything that we do has many, many consequences down through the years, and we can't predict any of them. Okay, so the point of all this being essentially that if you look at it in this way, you can see that in this sense to err is not human. It's common because there are various things, stumbling blocks and so on, in people's way, in everybody's way. This comes to the Christian notion of original sin, whether you call it original sin because you're Catholic or whether you call it something else because you're not Catholic. It's still basically the same concept everybody has, that we live in a fallen world. The world is not what it's supposed to be. And so it's an important thing to bear in mind whenever you look at this, that it is important to be understanding of evil, and using evil in the technical philosophical sense, anything that's not going right. So like, lying and theft and so on. Snapping at somebody in anger when that was inappropriate, etc. Those are all evil in the technical philosophical sense. So any evil is not something natural to the person doing it. It is the result of some sort of deprivation, privation, lack, absence, whatever you want to call it, in them, in their character, in their body, and so on. You don't know which for any given person. God knows, but we don't. The person themselves may or may not. And so it is important to remember, especially because if, say committing adultery was a proper part of being human, then it wouldn't be sinful because it would be a proper thing to do. The very fact that it is evil, or sinful, the terms are essentially interchangeable, is itself an indication that it is not natural to us. Because again, anything which is natural is good, in natural in the sense of like what's supposed to be part of us. And now this is a problem which I won't get into, but just to make you aware of, that there are two very distinct senses of the word natural. There is natural in the sense of like, on what you find on nature shows. That is to say, whatever happens to be around is, without a human being having consciously chosen to make it that way, is natural in that sense. But then there's the Aristotelian Thomistic sense, the Greek sense, whatever you want to call it, of natural, which is what things actually are supposed to be. And so, in that sense, for example, a teapot whose spout has broken off, it is not natural to a teapot to have no spout. Again, and that's a human artifice, which actually makes it particularly useful in this case, because there's no such thing as a natural teapot in the former sense, but a teapot has a nature as something made by a human being according to an idea. And so it is natural in that sense for a teapot to have a spout. So that gives you a sense of the words natural and how they're used here, and how I've been using it throughout the video. So, I believe that covers it. I'm sure there's something I'll have left out. But anyway, it's a very important distinction to make, whether or not something is natural and whether or not evil is natural to us. Is that it is not, but you have to think about things correctly in order for it to be clear why evil is not natural to us. And it's practical it's very useful. It's good to know in its own right. It's also practical because there are other systems which essentially result in other systems which more or less hold that evil is natural, and so that also kind of clearly rules them out as being possibly true. So, I think that covers it. I'm sure I left something out, so feel free to ask questions and so on. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.